Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Karen Yankovich, and I am so excited to be here today with the Stacey Harris. Stacey was on my podcast ages ago, like way too long ago, and she's got a podcast also. We're going to talk about that because she's got a celebration around that today. But this is just my show that I do every Tuesday at 4 o'clock Eastern to just introduce some of the really smart, amazing women in my life that can support you, and introduce people in my life to my LinkedIn network and to the people in my Facebook group who are watching this. So Stacey, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It has been so long since we did that podcast episode.
It really was.
It was
really a long time ago. Yeah. It was episode 37. We just came out with episode 139.
Wow. So, I was 102 episodes ago.
You were 102 episodes
ago. It's a lifetime in podcasting.
So speaking of podcasts, well, first of all, I want to tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm the Stacey Harris. I own an agency called Uncommonly More. We work with female leaders who are in the podcasting space, specifically because they are using a podcast as their content marketing strategy for their business. So they're generating content as a way to connect and nurture leads and convert them. And so we talk about podcasting very strategically. I also do some high-level marketing inside of our agency for select clients. My team acts as their sort of contract marketing department, which is a really good time. But even them, all of them have podcasts. I talk a lot about podcasts. I edit a lot of podcasts.
Do you?
I know podcasting.
Yeah.
Well, less me now. Now we have editors on the team that do it. But yeah, that's what I did for a long time.
Tell us about your podcast.
Today marked episode 500 of my podcast.
It's crazy, I want to give you such a high five across the country.
Thank you.
That's amazing because
it is.
Yeah, I started podcasting for the exact reasons you just said. I really wanted different kinds of content, and for me, I feel like my personality came out a little more in a podcast than in a blog. Not that I'm not really a writer. I mean, I can write and I can tweak things and I know what I want it to look like, but I was just getting oh my gosh, if I have to do one more blog about 5 ways to, I was, it was just seeming like I was just dialing it in instead of really delivering.
Totally.
And, but I had no idea podcasting was going to be as much work as it is. But it's worth it. It's worth it because it's so much fun. So tell us about your podcast journey.
So it's very funny because my podcast started for much of the same reason yours did. Blog posts, thank you. Blog posts were very laborious. It would take me forever to get one out. Mostly because I have a much bigger filter between my brain and my fingers than I do my brain and my mouth. It's just, there's a shortcut here where just stuff comes out. It's new to me too, guys. I'm hearing it for the first time as well. And so it just worked better because I would edit as I was writing and I was like, great. So we've removed every bit of personality and or uniqueness from this piece of content. Mm-hmm. It's literally a list of steps. Just do these 6 things. Mm-hmm. That's not interesting to read, and nor does it work as a marketing strategy. And so I was like, hey, I should try doing this. And I talked to a friend of mine who was in my mastermind at the time. And I was talking to her and she's like, don't you have a degree in audio engineering? And I was like, I do actually. So not only can I just talk into a microphone, I have the ability to edit it in my sleep. I know how to do all of the pieces. So I was like, well, we'll try it and we'll see how it goes. And here we are. A month from today would actually be 7 years since the podcast launched.
But wait from the podcast explosion.
Oh yeah, we were an early adapter, certainly in the business space. I think there were a lot of podcasts then. Well, there were some podcasts then, but they all fit firmly into 2 categories, like comedians who were using their show to market their comedy, and really nerdy, sub-interest group. Basically, the audio version of Reddit was basically the other side of podcasting at the time, and so it's been interesting to watch how not just my show evolved, but how podcasting as a medium has evolved. Certainly, there's more women podcasting now than there were then.
Yeah, there definitely are. Which I think is awesome. But my dog only wants to get noisy and run around. She's been sleeping on the couch all day long. Now she's right behind me playing with the dog. So sorry, guys.
They always know.
Yeah. So I agree with you. And what I love about it, and I've actually come to the point where, like, let's say you say, like, we're talking and you say, oh, do you follow, Joe Schmo? And I'm like, no, tell me about him. And then you'll tell me about him. I'll immediately go look for his podcast. And if he doesn't have one, I get annoyed. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I gotta read his blog. I gotta find, like, I want to hear his podcast. I want to hear his energy. I want to hear his voice or her voice, right? And I've actually gotten to the point now where I kind of almost expect people to have a podcast, which of course is silly because you don't need one. But the fact is that if you had a podcast, then I would have saved it and listened to it and perhaps taken another step or two down that know, like, and trust path versus, all right, let me just subscribe to his email list and then it goes into the black hole of my inbox.
Right? Yeah. You know what's funny though is I think you can accomplish the same. You can test the waters to see if something like that would work for you, because absolutely, I'm going in and I'm searching their name in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you consume podcasts. But I will also take they've been a guest on other shows.
Yes.
Because so I think there is a lot of time and overwhelm with podcasting. And they're like, I don't know if I'm even going to be interesting on microphone.
Yeah.
Great. Spend the next 6 months getting on other people's podcasts, understanding the process. You'll get an insight into what it's like to sit behind a microphone and talk to a computer. Granted, you have the benefit of another person being there, which is way easier than a solo show. Right. There's only so many times you can have a conversation alone in a room and be like, I'm not crazy. So try it, like, see what it does for you, if you enjoy it or don't enjoy it, but also you will be amazed at the audience impact, the notability. I really think podcasts are like writing a book. They're one of those things that people are like, oh, you could do that? And they're amazed by this, like, mythical, magical thing you have the ability to create. And it immediately kind of elevates you in a way, expertise-wise, that I don't think a blog does anymore.
I agree. And, it's interesting that you're saying that because, what I basically do is teach LinkedIn marketing. But a big part of what we teach on LinkedIn is getting that credibility. And part of that is getting on podcasts, right? And I remember 2 years ago, maybe it was PodFest in Orlando, 2 years, not this past one, but the one before. I met a woman there who had flown in from California and she didn't have a podcast, but her sole goal was to get podcast interviews. I was like, that's genius. That's genius. Like, she was willing to invest the flight, the hotel, whatever it cost her, because I know, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing. There's a value to just getting in front of other people's audiences, and there's credibility that lends to that, so much so that we've actually incorporated a ton of that strategy into my LinkedIn programs. And when the world opens up again, we're going to be doing some masterminds around podcast conferences to help my students, land more podcast interviews, because it is such a great way to get that, because like you said, and a lot of people don't realize this, before I had a podcast, one of the reasons that pushed me to get a podcast was somebody said to me, I threw your name in iTunes and, like, it came up 25 times. And I was like, really? Like, I had no idea. Like, I didn't even think of that. And then I'm like, well, if I'm coming up 25 times on other people's shows, right? Like, maybe I should do my own show.
Absolutely. So and here's the deal, is people are using that as a search engine. They are just going in there and going, hey, and even from a, like, Google SEO perspective, if you Google my name, some of the top listings are podcasts I've been on from other people, not that far behind my own flipping website.
Right.
And my podcast stuff, like my show on all of the bazillion of places you can consume podcasts.
Right.
And it really is one of those ways that is not without effort. I mean, it's going to take time. And, I love the story of the woman who went to PodFest. I think that's a genius thing to do, because as podcasters, we've all gotten the dozens of weekly emails asking us if they can be on our show that are terrible pitches. But if I meet you at an event and we're talking and you're interesting, and I already know that we can have a good, like, back and forth, like we can jive in a conversation.
Yeah, I say the exact same thing.
So much easier. I'm like, yes, for sure, come be on my podcast. And I don't have guests anymore. And I'm like, yes, let's do it.
I don't have guests, but we'll do one for you. Or maybe we won't, right?
I'll be honest, that if that's the only way to get a guest spot on my show at this point.
I
If
agree.
you meet and I go, cool, this is valuable to the people I have spent 7 years nurturing and growing and bringing together and earning their mother love and trust. I'm not blowing it on a crappy guest. But if I know you and we connect and I know you're going to be of value, I got no problem. That's why the bulk of my my guests, when we do have them, are clients.
Right.
They're clients of the business.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I feel the same way. I get a lot of pitches, and every now and then I'll have somebody on my team review them, and they'll say, how about this person? How about that person? So sometimes we do pull them on, but honestly, those are not always our best shows. And I know that. And then that puts you in the position, like you said, like, what am I doing? Right. So, But one of the other things I want to ask you about, to see if, and you've got 500 shows, so you're way further down the road than me. So maybe as I get further down the road, this won't be the case anymore. But one of the things I didn't realize from a content perspective about podcasting is that I get listens to every single show every single month. And I had no idea that was going to happen. So I certainly couldn't say that about my blog. There was certainly not people reading every single blog every single month, right? But so that was really interesting, and it had me shift. And when I teach other people, it had me shift the strategy a little bit, because now I want to make sure if I'm saying go here for this, and it's 2 years from now, that when they go here, maybe they won't find this, but they'll find something, because I just didn't even realize that was going to happen. And that's pretty cool.
It is. One of the things to realize is when you go subscribe to a show, it's not just pulling last week's episode. When you go open that app, you're pulling everything. And so I don't get episodes. I don't get downloads to every single show anymore.
500, I was going to say, you're further ahead. So I would imagine at some point
heavens, because if people were listening to episode 5 of this show, I would die of embarrassment, all like 5th grade, just open up a hole in the ground and I fall into it. I'm like, no, don't listen, please. I mean, I'm not taking it down because like I did that. It's staying up. But still, no one needs to hear it, okay? It just needs to exist, and we all know that it happened.
We're all going to go listen to episode 5 now, right?
I know. And it's bad, and I apologize in advance. Then go listen to 500, and you can hear my growth, okay? It's like a before and after situation. But yeah, you do get downloads all the time. One of the things that I talk a lot about with our clients, because our focus is really on strategic podcasting. That's why we work with people who are building podcasts to build their expertise. It is a part of their business model. It's not the entirety of their business model. They're not looking for sponsors. One of the terms we use a lot is like a self-sponsored podcast. Your business, your speaking career, your books, they are the sponsor of your show. And so when we talk about that, this isn't something we're doing for funsies. This is not a hobby.
Right.
This is not me going on and talking about Schitt's Creek with my best friend for an hour once a week because it's a good time and it's happening anyways. So we might as well tell people about it. Right. And so I'm not creating anything just for the sake of creating. And so when you think about these episodes, think about the lifespan of them. Think about how will this conversation be helpful to somebody who finds it a year from now. And I'll be honest, I am not somebody who has been perfect at this for the entirety of the lifespan of my business, but for a long time we had a map of like redirects that needed to happen when we dropped things, or I kept up sales pages so they had wait lists, or it would say redirect. This changed a lot when I went from the Stacey Harris to launching the agency in 2019, because so much shifted in launching the agency. And so it's a little messier now than it once was. Like if you go listen to like 300, you will straight up hear things that just redirect to uncommonlymore.com.
Right.
Yeah. But one of the things that we've shifted our clients to, and we're actually finally building out for ourselves because, cobbler shoes, is a resource page. So you're sending them to uncommonlymore.com/resources.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Every episode. And that's got all of your opt-ins on it.
That's a great idea.
You can control it kind of like you would like your link tree on Instagram, right? You can control it. So when you have something that's like you're opening up your mastermind, or when the world opens up again, a live event or a specific program or offering, you can prioritize that at the top and be like, hey, this is the thing I really want you to pay attention to. But also you'll find that they have all of their sort of opt-in options there for them. And then they can click through and see the specifics of those if they want to. And what I love about that is we're actually seeing people who are opting in for more than one thing.
Yeah.
Or who are maybe came here for this, but then ended up over here. And they'll email us and they're like, I was going to sign up for XYZ program, but actually ABC looked really good. So I just bought it. I'm like,
right.
That's working pretty well then. And so I think having something like that, having some sort of like consistent central place that you're sending them to can be really helpful in sort of that lifespan of episodes. Also, again, going into your episode going, cool, will this make any sense in a year? And not every episode's going to be a yes, and that's okay too. Right. There are absolutely episodes I have on Google Plus that are irrelevant at this point, outside of like comedy value, I guess.
Right.
But there was a window, guys, where it almost kind of mattered. Okay. Almost kind of. But they were completely relevant at the time. And so not everything's going to be like,
right,
it's great forever, but a lot of it can really stand the test of time if you go into it with the mentality of building out that asset.
Right. I love that. So one of the questions that came up, and I don't have it in front of me, but one of the questions that came up in the Facebook group when they saw you were going to be on, and this is actually, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, was, with the explosion of podcasts. So when I started my podcast 239 episodes ago, which is more than 2 years ago because I skipped a few weeks here and there, right? But I really thought like, okay, I have a decent sized audience. I'm going to get sponsors and blah, blah, blah. But then everybody started to get podcasts, right? And while I definitely love that my downloads grow every month, they're nowhere near what I thought they were going to be. But when I look at it, I think to myself, well, how many podcasts do you have on this phone that you really want to listen to every week and don't? Because there's just so many hours in a day, right? So I think that that's impacted now. And as since then, a lot more people have podcasts, right? So how do you advise people that are starting a podcast now? Because like you, my podcast is a part of my business strategy. People learn about me from my podcast. I'm from New Jersey. You either like that I talk fast and get to the point or you don't. If you like it, call me and I'll see if I can help you. If you don't, that's cool. Call Stacey. She's a little bit more chill than me, right? And that's cool because I don't need a million clients, right? So I love that the podcast allows that to happen. But I do get her point where she's like, is it still worth doing considering there's just so many podcasts now?
Well, I would argue that there's just so many like things you could watch on Netflix. It doesn't stop you from watching Netflix, nor does it stop Netflix from producing shows for us, right? And so, heck, even streaming services as a whole at this point, I'm like, guys, I know I always said I wanted to just pick the channels I would watch, but this is more expensive. But I think it's easy to get into this place of, well, everybody has already done it, and so I don't need to do it. And the reality is there's a lot of people, there's also an exponentially larger amount of people listening to podcasts than ever did before. And so, yes, 7 years ago when I started podcasting, there was not nearly as much competition as there is now. But there also was a tiny fraction of the amount of people who knew what podcasting was, much less cared to listen to it. I think about 7 years ago, people listening to their podcasts in their car, that took effort.
Right.
Like you had to know how to technologically figure that out.
Right.
And it mostly meant probably you were listening to it on speakerphone in your cup holder. Like, let's be honest, right? That's how we were listening to podcasts 7 years ago. Whereas now I plug my phone into my car and she turns on and there the podcast app opens and it starts with like I was turning on the radio. And so, yes, there are more people podcasting. And yes, there are more people consuming podcasting. So worry less about there's too many people already and more about how do I stand out to the people who want to listen to me and how do I keep them coming back week after week? How do I keep them interested long enough to stay in it? Because that's the other thing is there's a lot of podcasts that have 7 to 25 episodes.
Right.
Because they just stopped.
Right.
So thinking about, going into it, with a long-term strategy, saying you're going to stay in the game will help a ton. But also realizing that your people will listen to your episode. I'm guessing there's also a lot of people that do what this person does for a living.
Right.
You gotta kind of set that aside and be like, cool, my people are also there and I will find that group of them.
Right. And you know what? It's nice to be able to, send people to episodes. So if I'm talking to somebody somewhere about anything, I can say, you know what, I did a podcast episode about this. Let me find it and send it to you.
Totally.
So there's always that too. And then that gets people listening more, or then you kind of leverage the opportunity to be on other people's podcasts, share your podcast, and that gets you new listeners, right? So, which potentially gets you more business depending on how you're using your podcast.
And that's one of the things I love most about being on other people's shows is my listenership always goes up after I've had a show come out, regardless of the size of the audience of that show. I mean, obviously a larger audience generally produces a larger impact, but I'll always see at least a little jump right after an episode from somebody else goes live, because you're literally talking to people who already listen to podcasts.
Right. Exactly. Which is awesome.
You're talking to the choir. You're not outside trying to get more people in the building.
Right. Like when my podcast first came out, I remember I was at dinner with my friends, grabbing everybody's phone saying, all right, hold on. I'm downloading the podcast app. I'm downloading my podcast. Just hit this button once a week for a while. Help me out. Like we don't do that anymore. Right.
It's true. Yeah. I'll also say though, and I have the exact numbers in, I've started a free LinkedIn group for podcasters, and I have the exact numbers in there, and I can't remember what they are off the top of my head now, but if you have over 30 days, if you have, I think it's like 180 people download your episode, you are in the top 50 shows on Libsyn.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of talk about these numbers needing to be exponentially high to get results. Right. And that's actually not true. Almost no one's numbers are getting, almost no one is getting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of episodes, or downloads day one every time their episode comes out. That's not actually a thing.
I know.
So if we can just universally set that aside, a lot more people will get in the game and be like, I can do this. Right.
And know that it's a tool. It's a tool in your business. And it's a valuable tool. It's a valuable tool. I have a group program. She's linked up my group LinkedIn program. And Tuesdays is our weekly Q&A call. And somebody had said, because one of the things we do is we help people get podcasts up, guests on podcast, building relationships, right? That's the theme of what we do. And she was like, I got so many podcast interviews this week. What do I do when they're all coming out at the same time? I was like, you know what? You share them. And then you share them again, and I said, generally speaking, most podcast hosts that are thinking about some podcast hosts don't worry about downloads. And I kind of try to fall into that category. But if they are thinking about them, they're thinking about how many they're getting in the first month the show goes live. So share it a couple times in the first month, but share it again. Share it. It's content you can share forever. And when if somebody was on my podcast and 6 months or a year from now, they share that show again and tag me, I'm sure to share that with my audience. And now I'm getting more visibility for that guest. And we're continuing to support each other down the road. So it's not just the day that it comes out, you want to share it. It's evergreen content. You can share it forever.
And the same is true with your own show. Mm-hmm. We regularly build out content, not just resharing the actual link, but we'll go in and harvest social content from the transcripts of the podcast. It's like, okay. And my team does this. My team builds all the social stuff for us now. And she goes through and she'll look at the transcript and she'll just pull out quotes. And she's like, great, that's a great Instagram caption. You're building something that you can repurpose in so many ways. One of my favorite ways that I do not use enough, and I'm totally calling myself on it right now, is I love taking transcripts from my podcast and repurposing them into articles for LinkedIn and blog posts for LinkedIn, because
I get the same slot. I teach LinkedIn and I don't do it enough.
I know. And I tell every podcaster to do it.
Yeah.
I'm just really need to do that. But it's every time I do it, I always include a link at the end. Hey, if you want to listen to the audio version of this, go over there. I get downloads for that episode, and I get a ton of people paying attention to what I was talking about. And I only had to say it once, and now I've turned it into at least 2 pieces of content. When I submit content for other people's sites, I've written for sites like Huffington Post and Forbes and all sorts of places. all of those are transcripts from the podcast that we edited.
Right.
Like those are not separate new ideas.
So I'm going to give you like the perfect world that I don't live in, but in a perfect world, what I would be doing with my podcast, and I teach this and I don't do it. I haven't done it in a while. In fact, I'm going to, like, my team that's listening to this, make me do this, is the week after, or the week before, like the week of the podcast, to do it like a 3-minute, here's what's on the show this week. Like, you're going to love this, because on LinkedIn, like, if I'm going to use LinkedIn strategy, you could put a link to your podcast, but who's scrolling through LinkedIn and going, wow, this sounds cool. Let me jump all the way over to to iTunes now and listen to this podcast. But what they might do is watch, especially if it's captioned, a 2-minute video where you're like, I had Stacey Harris on the show. We talked about this. You're not going to want to miss it. Somewhere around 20 minutes in, you're going to totally want to catch that piece of the conversation. But really what you're going to learn the most is this. So just like a little promo video. But that video then can get put up in YouTube, and that video can then go in the LinkedIn article, because you can't stream the audio in there, but you can put the LinkedIn video in there. And that just adds more, because then that's just that. I mean, listen, Stacey, I can pull up 10 of my episodes, change my top 10 times, and do 10 of those in 25 minutes, right? Yep. And then have them in a Dropbox folder, and then they can be shared as content, but it's also now Google content, and it's just leveraging that podcast. So that's, we've been working really hard on our program lately, that our own content has suffered a little bit. We've been getting the podcast out every week, but we haven't done the promo that I would like to be doing on it, because we've done
totally understand that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we teach virtual networking, and like, we're living in this virtual networking world. So it's really crazy. Fun, but anyway, but that would then give you a little video to put in that article, and then you can say, if you want to listen to the whole show, click here, and then put the show notes and whatever you want to put from the article. Yeah. And that's a really robust LinkedIn article. It can go up about a month or two after the episode went live, so that you're giving the episode time to do its own SEO thing, and you're feeding Google with another YouTube video about it, right? So yeah, it doesn't take that much time, and what I love about stuff like that is you're diving deeper into what you're already doing, instead of always out there scrambling to go wider. I'd rather be going deeper.
Absolutely. And then that's one of the things we talk so much about with our clients. Again, we tend to do a better job of doing it for clients than I do for doing it myself. A cobbler shoe situation. Yeah. But yeah, it's such low-hanging fruit. Like it's something that doesn't take that much. And one of the things, we've had clients do in the past is actually record something like that the same day they do the episode. Right. Especially for those clients who have guests, I'll be like, cool, grab out your phone and shoot it right now. And then that's their Instagram story that day. Yeah. And they didn't have to try and remember what they talked about 6 weeks ago with this guest or 8 weeks ago. It just gets done. And for me, I batch each sort of section, each task of the show. So all of my outlining happens at once, all of my recording happens at once. And then I can just go through and I could record those videos real quick, and just everything would be done, especially for those of you who have a VA or a team in place who's helping you with any of this stuff. If you give it to them, they can go do stuff with it. But how often are they waiting for us to deliver them the thing they can go do things with? And with a podcast, it's really easy to go, cool, we'll pull clips from this and take care of that really quick.
Well, and I also think too, and by the way, we're going to wrap this soon. So if anybody has any questions for Stacey, now's the time to pop them in, whether you're on Facebook or LinkedIn, or for me. But I really think it's important that when and I know this is like preaching to the choir here, but when you're posting content about your podcast, you have to recognize the platform you're posting it on. And like I said about LinkedIn, the native use of that isn't going to be, well, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm checking this out, let me now go click on this and go to listen to the podcast. So really the goal of the social should be to intrigue people so that they're like, I want to check this out. Right. So it's really not to have them stop everything and go listen to that podcast right now. But it could be maybe go in and queue it up, right? Or write the name down, or, take them to the show notes page so they can bookmark it and come back to it. Right. So I think the expectations of people listening to your whole show from your, tweet is unrealistic. What do you think?
I completely agree. I think, it's funny. I think in this weird way, we assume no one will ever listen to us, and that also everyone will drop everything the moment we say anything and only listen to us. Like we have to pick which because we sort of bounce back and forth between these two things. And I think you're exactly right. And I would take it a step further and say, even in the promotion of it, paying attention to where you're sending them based on what network they're in. I mean, if they're on Instagram, they're already on this thing. Great. Send them to the podcast player so that they can subscribe. But I think you also have to be cognizant of, I probably don't want to open an Apple Podcast link when I'm sitting on my computer in your Facebook group or in LinkedIn. Like, send me to your website, because then I could go, oh, hey, this is a really interesting podcast. Oh, look, I can also work with her.
Right.
Like, thinking about what link we're choosing to share. And even it drives me. This is a minor soapbox moment. Stop only sharing your Apple Podcast link, because there are lots of people, although I am an Apple Podcast user, I will be honest, lots of people aren't.
Yeah.
In fact, half the device owners in the world don't have this thing and don't have Apple Podcasts. And so I think paying attention to where you're sending them as part of your strategy for what you want them to do. It's not just listen, it's get engaged some way.
Yeah. Yeah. So Lena, who's on my team, just posted this. This is the question I mentioned earlier. So I think we mostly answered this already, but is there anything else you would recommend for someone who's considering launching a new podcast soon?
I think the biggest thing to pay attention to is, and I've got a 5-day free launch your podcast training that asks a lot of these questions. If you go to uncommonlymore.com/launch your podcast, who do you want to listen? Why do you want them to listen? What do you want them to do when they listen? If you can think about those things first, it'll get you a lot of the answers that you need to know when it comes to doing your show. Should I do seasons? How long should they be? How should I have guests? You'll always come back to the answers to those 3 questions. Who do you want listening? Why do you want listening? Why do you want them listening? What do you want them to do when they're done listening? If you can answer those questions, you'll figure out a ton of answers to those other podcast questions.
I love that. So we have another question from Julio. What do you think about podcast reviews?
I love podcast reviews. They're great. The thing to consider is the fact that Apple Podcasts and Stitcher, and there's one other one that is totally escaping my, are really the only and it's a smaller platform.
I was just thinking, I only know
with reviews.
I don't even know what it is.
And so, like, yes, they matter, and they're mostly an ego thing. Like they're nice to have. I absolutely ask for them regularly because I like to have at least some current ones there, so people are like, oh, hey, she still is not a terrible human. Right. Yeah, but it's
that's what they might think if you didn't have podcast reviews. They'd say
exactly that I'm a horrible human being.
You must be a terrible human.
It's the only possible other option. And so for me, it comes down to I would rather prioritize other calls to action in the majority of my shows.
Yeah.
And so where we ask for reviews is actually mostly on social. I'll say, hey, if you love the show, will you? And we've been doing it a lot around the 500th episode because it's a good time to get people excited. And it's sort of like a happy 500th episode gift. Like you go to somebody's house and you bring them wine. If you're going to listen to my 500th episode, you need to leave a review. It's only fair. Right. And so I think for me, they're really nice to have. They can be really helpful. I think no reviews is a little sketchy. It's easier to get guests if you have reviews because I always look at reviews when I get invited to be on shows, to make sure they're not a terrible human. And I think so. Yes. And prioritize your other calls to action over that. Prioritize subscribe, prioritize opt in on the email list, prioritize your sales. Because I think it's really easy for podcasters to hide in asking for reviews instead of actually generating business.
Right, because what exactly is a review getting you, right? Like I want people to kind of into I want to get their email address, right? So I want, that's really my goal from the podcast. But, I do agree with you that it does give you some credibility too. So I go back and forth. Sometimes I ask for reviews, sometimes I don't. For a while there, I was actually saying, we randomly, like if somebody sends us a review, we'll even we sometimes send little gifts more importantly, I want them to share our podcast. So if you share the podcast, we pick random people and we'll send you a little gift in the mail, just because it's fun to do that. And I like to be able to reward people. We stopped doing that. It was fun to do for a while. But it is less about, I mean, if you're going to share it on social, that's social proof, right? That's not just Karen has a podcast. It's Karen has a podcast and I'm listening to it. Right. So to me, I almost think that's more important than the review. But I agree with you that having a bunch of reviews does give credibility. I mean, it's same as having a lot of LinkedIn, recommendations, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're not a good person if you don't have any, but if you do have some, it's a really confident thing. If somebody says to you, well, tell me how about your podcast, and you go, well, check it out on Apple Podcasts. We have 100, 200 reviews. That is a really confident position to be in when you're negotiating for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
So there's good credibility reasons to have reviews, but I think from a practicality, share my show.
I agree. I think, they're nice to have. I definitely encourage people to regularly be asking for them because most people will not do it if you don't ask. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you need to. I don't think you need to be doing it all the time.
Right. So what do you think about this?
How can a new podcast attract guests for interviews? How should it be done? And on a new podcast, it is harder because if I'm going to go spend an hour being on your show, I'm going to need to know that you're going to have somebody that listens. I will say, though, that I have been on lots of new shows, and I actually, in a lot of ways, favor newer, smaller shows because they're still putting an effort into marketing their show.
Yes. And I would say
I was trying to find a nice way to say that, but
that's
kind of where we're at.
I agree with you. But even as a podcast host, I would say that don't be afraid to have people that don't have big audiences on your show, because I've had some big names on my show and they don't market it. But if I have somebody on the show that is newer in marketing or is grateful to be on the show for the visibility, they're sharing it all over the place. So, and Lena, I don't know if you caught the beginning of this, but Stacey was talking about how her favorite way to get guests, and I agree, it's the same with me, is when you meet people and you're, and you're talking to people, and that's a great way to get guests. So I think no matter how new your show is, I think you can do that. I mean, because listen, we've all seen the Facebook posts in, these big Facebook groups that's like, hey, I have a new podcast. Who wants to be interviewed? And 937 people say me, right?
Yeah.
So there should never be a problem getting guests. The problem really is getting the right guests. And I feel like that comes down to your relationships with the people. And when you bring people on that, like you were at episode 37. And I only do a guest every other week. So you're in like the top 20 of the people I knew that I wanted to have on my show in the beginning, right? Because I knew you had it. I knew you knew social. I knew you would promote it. And I knew you were good at your stuff, right? And I knew it would be a good conversation. But think about the people and start there. And those are going to be great shows too, because there'll be rapport and they'll share it.
Yeah, I think I always say start with your inner circle and then work your way out. Mm-hmm. I think more people are willing to jump on a new show than people really give them credit to, because some people just want to be on a show. Like they just want to be on a show. Yeah. The other thing I would say is, and I love when people do this, and I'm thinking of it because I actually have an email in my inbox I need to respond to right now. I love when people say, hey, who else do you know that you think would be a great fit for this show? And then ask for an introduction. And I had a friend who was on another podcast who just introduced me to a podcast host to be on their show because he asked that question. Hey, who else do you think my audience should know about? And I think that is a great way to maintain guest quality. Mm-hmm. Because again, you don't have to ask every guest, but those guest conversations that go really well, it's like, hey, who else do you know? A referral works there as well. I think sometimes we think about referrals only as being like, who can I sell this to? But asking who somebody knows, asking your friends, hey, I want to have someone on my show. Who do you know that would be good for my show? Right. Start there. You'll find you'll get a lot better quality. And yes, absolutely cannot be said enough. People traditionally, generally, not every time, but with smaller audiences are much more likely to share. And I would rather actually get shared to 100 people than be totally ignored by 100,000 people.
That's agreeable.
Yeah. And oftentimes those smaller audience people haven't said their story on 437 other podcasts in the exact same words they're going to use on your podcast.
Right.
We've all heard those episodes too. Like we always know when somebody's launching a book because suddenly every other episode, every other podcast in my feed is they're on somebody's show. And I'm like,
Right.
new book coming out. Good to know.
Exactly.
Oh, it's launch season for that course again. Good to know.
Absolutely. All right. So how can people find more out about you, Stacey?
Everything you need to know about me is over at uncommonlymore.com. I'm there. The team is there. The podcast is there. It's everything.
Is that your podcast name, Uncommonly More?
Yep. Yes, we renamed the podcast this year after we launched the agency. So Uncommonly More.
Awesome. Awesome. This was so fun. Thank you. I didn't even, so episode 137, KarenYankovich.com/037, not 137, 037. You can listen to the original episode of Stacey and I. I don't really care what you think about my early episodes. It probably definitely aren't going to be as smooth as the later ones, but it is what it is. So, you know,
I kind of want to listen because I'm like, what did we sound like?
Gosh. All right, guys, this was fun. Thank you so much, Stacey, for being here. And
Thank you.
yeah, and you know what, Stacey, if you want to pop into LinkedIn, you can drop there was something else you mentioned earlier that I was thinking I wanted you to put a link in.
Uncommonlymore.com/launch your podcast. It's the free 5-day training that walks you through, yes, like tech and stuff like that, but also like some strategic things you need to think about before you launch a show.
Yep. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Stacey. This was great.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.